The spring of 1927 came early to Grassy Cove. The redbuds along the eastern ridge had barely finished their blooming when Pearl found her mother in the garden, kneeling beside the first tomato bed as she had knelt beside it 1,000 mornings before. Clara Wren Tarpley's hands were still in the soil when Pearl reached her, not clutching it, not fallen into it by accident, but resting in the dark earth, the way a person rests a hand on the shoulder of someone they love. The fingers were still and the face was turned slightly downward, as though she had bent to listen for something moving far below the surface. Pearl did not cry out. She stood for a long moment in the cool morning air and looked at her mother's hands, at the nails tinted faintly blue from 4 decades of spring water and mineral-rich soil, and then she looked up at the stone spring house her father had built, where the blue light was already rising through the glass panels in the roof and casting its strange and beautiful glow across the interior walls. The mountain was still giving. It had not stopped, and it would not stop, and whatever Clara Wren had been when she arrived at this piece of cursed ground in 1881, she had become something the mountain recognized as its own. Pearl would later say it looked as though her mother had been planting something, setting one more seed into the living ground before she went. Her youngest brother would say it looked instead as though she had bent down to listen, an ear turned toward the soil to hear the nation of small laboring creatures that their grandmother Agnes Hooper had first described to a 9-year-old girl working in a kitchen garden 50 years before. Perhaps she was doing both. Perhaps planting and listening had always been the same act, and Clara had spent a lifetime learning that they were. The voice that rises now is hers. It has always been hers, and it begins as it always began, with the plainest fact she knew. I never inherited a thing. That single fact is what separates my story from every other one you have heard whispered across porch rails and church socials, the stories about girls who open a letter from some city lawyer and learn that a forgotten uncle has left them 40 acres and a mule. No envelope ever came for me. No name was ever spoken over a will with my future folded inside it. The truth, plain as the dirt under my fingernails, is that nobody remembered I existed. What I built because I had $1 soft as cloth in my pocket and a stubbornness that frightened every sensible person who tried to talk me out of it. But before I tell you what I found waiting at the bottom of that limestone bluff, I have to tell you who I was, because the two things cannot be separated. The girl and the water are the same story. My mother named me Clara, after her own mother, and she named me Wren for the smallest bird that sings the loudest. She told me that once when I was small enough to sit in her lap in the evening while the mountains went dark outside the window, and I held on to the explanation the way a child holds on to a story that feels true before she is old enough to know why. My mother died when I was 9 years old of a fever the doctor in Crossville called influenza, and the mountains simply called the cost of winter. My father had been gone the year before, that crushed under a poplar that fell the wrong way on a slope that gave no warning to anyone. I had no aunt, no grandmother, no cousin twice removed who might take in a girl with empty hands. What I had was 7 years inside the walls of the Cumberland mountain home for the indigent learning to be useful so that no one could call me a burden out loud. Inside those walls, I learned to scrub a floor until the grain of the wood showed through, to turn a heel on a stocking, to keep my eyes down and my questions behind my teeth. The keeping quiet was the hardest lesson, and also the most important, because the home was not a place that rewarded questions. Questions made the staff tired. Questions made the matrons suspicious. A girl who asked why was a girl who thought she was owed an explanation, and orphans were not owed explanations. There was one exception to that rule, and her name was Mrs. Agnes Hooper. She ran the kitchen garden the way a general runs a campaign, with a clear mind, a long memory, and absolutely no patience for waste of any kind, including the waste of a curious child. She was old by the time I knew her, with hands like cured leather and an eye that could read a wilting leaf the way a doctor reads a fevered pulse. She took me on because I asked her once why the bean row in the eastern bed grew taller than the one in the western bed. They were planted the same day from the same seed packet in what looked to me like the same soil. Every other adult in that building would have told me to mind my work. Mrs. Hooper crouched down beside me in the dirt, and she explained that the morning sun and the slope of the drainage had conspired to feed one row better than the other. Two invisible things working together had produced a visible difference, and the only way to understand a garden was to learn to see the invisible things. That was the first lesson. There were hundreds more. She taught me that dirt is not dirt. She would take a handful of soil and crumble it slow between her fingers and tell me it was alive, that there was a whole nation of creatures too small to see all of them, laboring in the dark to turn death back into food. She taught me to bury kitchen scraps and rotted leaves and let them ripen into what she called black gold. She taught me to move the crops from bed to bed each season so the ground never grew tired of feeding the same mouths. And she taught me the thing I have carried the longest, that a plant and the earth it stands in are locked in a quiet and endless bargain, and that a good gardener is simply the one who learns the terms and honors them. She used to say that a tomato was the truest witness a garden could call. Good soil grows an honest tomato, she told me more than once, and bad soil grows a beautiful lie. I did not understand that fully then. I understand it now in a way that would have made her smile, that close-lipped smile she saved for the rare times a lesson finally took root in someone she had been patient with. She died in the winter of 1880. A cough settled into her chest in November and would not be coaxed out, and by January it had taken her. When they buried her in the pauper's plot behind the home, I was the only one who cried, because I was the only one who understood what the world had just lost. The woman who took over the garden had no use for a girl who asked why instead of doing what she was told, and the new matron had even less use for one who tracked soil into the sewing room and smelled of compost at supper. But before she died, Mrs. Hooper called me to her bedside, not to give me wisdom, not to say a last prayer, or offer a last piece of advice about drainage or rotation. She held out a tin can small with holes punched through the bottom, the way you punch them for a seedling container, and inside the can was a handful of seeds wrapped in a square of cloth, a tomato variety she had nurtured for years, a great ribbed purple-shouldered type that she called her truest witness, the one she went back to every spring as a measure of whether the season would be honest or false. Sister Ruth was standing in the doorway when Mrs. Hooper pressed that can into my hands. Sister Ruth ran the disciplinary side of the home with the brisk efficiency of someone who believed strongly that children without family had already received more grace than they deserved, and she was not a woman inclined towards sentiment or exception. She saw exactly what passed between us. She looked at the tin can in my hands, and she looked at Mrs. Hooper's face, and she did not move from the doorway. She did not take the can from me. I learned why later. The home had a regulation buried in the pages of institutional policy that no one ever read aloud to the children, that personal effects transferred directly from a dying resident to another person present at the bedside were considered a private bequest and could not be reclaimed by the institution. The rule had been written to cover the occasional elderly pauper who wanted to leave a watch or a Bible to a friend. It had never been invoked to protect a tin can full of tomato seeds. But Sister Ruth was a woman who followed rules absolutely, even when she resented them, and the rule applied. That was the first time a rule of the system protected me instead of constraining me. I recognized it for what it was, a piece of luck, so accidental it felt like design, and I held on to that can the way I held on to everything that was mine, which is to say, I did not let go of it for any reason, and I told no one it existed. In March of 1881, 3 months before my 17th birthday, they put my few belongings in a flour sack and told me my time at the home had ended and that I ought to thank the institution for the years of Christian charity it had spent on me. I did not thank them. I walked out the gate with the flour sack over one shoulder and Mrs. Hooper's voice running in my head like water over rock, steady and unremarkable, and always moving. The only inheritance worth having is the kind that lives in your hands. I stopped in the hallway near the front door and looked at the small mirror hung there for the residents to check their appearances before receiving visitors. I did not look at my own face. I looked at the tin can in my hand, at the holes punched through the bottom, at the cloth-wrapped seeds inside. Then I walked out into March. The county assessor's office in Pikeville occupied a room at the front of the courthouse that smelled permanently of ink and wood smoke and old paper. The man behind the counter was named Aldous Henshaw, and he had ink stains worked so deep into the creases of his fingers that I doubted soap had ever touched the real color of his skin in years. He looked at me the way men look at stray dogs that wander too close to a supper table, with a mixture of pity and the wish that I would simply move along before I complicated his morning. I told him I had $1 and asked what $1 could buy. He laughed, not unkindly, and pulled a ledger toward him, running a stained finger down columns of figures until it stopped on a line he seemed almost embarrassed to read aloud. There was a lot he allowed out at the eastern edge of Grassy Cove, 2 acres assessed at 75 cents, untouched by any buyer in 3 full years. He set the ledger down before saying the rest, and the rest was the part that mattered to everyone but me. That was the Blue Spring lot, he told me. His voice dropped the way a man's voice drops when he speaks of a grave or a debt. The water there ran blue, he said, blue like nothing natural ought to be, blue that meant copper or sulfur or some poison the good Lord had buried, and the mountain had been foolish enough to dig back up. Nothing grew near it. The cattle a previous owner had tried to run there would stand at the far fence and bawl until the man surrendered and drove them off. Every soul in the cove had always known that land was bad, and every soul who had owned it had eventually come to agree. He looked at me with the weary patience of someone who had given up on being heard. "You don't want that land, girl." Before I could answer, a voice came from the far corner of the room where I had not noticed anyone sitting. Deputy Frank Colton was a heavy-set man in a county sheriff's badge who had apparently been drinking his morning coffee in Henshaw's office as a matter of daily habit. He set his cup down and looked at me with an expression different from Henshaw's. Not pity, suspicion. A minor buying real property without a guardian present was not standard procedure, he said. Did I have someone to speak on my behalf? I told him I was old enough to sign a labor contract, had been since I was 14, and that a deed was nothing but a contract between a buyer and a seller. Henshaw, who clearly wanted no part of a procedural dispute on a Monday morning, turned the pages of his reference materials until he found the relevant statute. Tennessee law permitted a person of 16 years to purchase real property outright provided no debt instrument was attached to the transaction. I was paying cash. There was nothing to dispute. Colton picked up his coffee cup again, but did not drink from it. He looked at the ledger, then at me, then at the door. Whatever he was thinking, he did not say it. He only set his cup down a second time as he left and paused in the doorway to deliver his parting observation without turning around. "Blue Spring lot," he said. "You'll understand why nobody wants it." Henshaw sighed. It was the first of a great many sighs I would collect over the years, the small, involuntary sounds that people make when a 16-year-old refuses to be saved from herself. He reached for the deed papers. The bill I handed him was so worn it had gone soft as a moth's wing, and he stared at it longer than he needed to, as though hoping I might snatch it back and come to my senses. I did not. He signed the papers, stamped them, and slid them across the counter. I picked up the deed and held it for a moment before putting it in my flour sack beside the tin can. It was the first document in the history of my existence that attached my name to something that belonged to me. I did not know what to do with the feeling it produced, so I put it away and walked out into the March morning, 4 miles from Pikeville to the back of Grassy Cove, with the spring sun warming the road and the mountains rising blue-green on every side. Grassy Cove is a peculiar geography, a great bowl pressed into the plateau by some ancient violence of the earth, ringed by ridges on every side, and drained by a creek that does not run to any river you can follow, but instead vanishes straight into the ground at the cove's low end, swallowed by the limestone, the way the cove swallows everything. The rock beneath is honeycombed with caverns and rivers no man has ever walked, and the water table moves through it with a logic entirely its own. My 2 acres lay at the eastern lip of that bowl, where the flat valley floor ran up against a wall of pale stone. The ground was mostly level, which was a mercy, but the soil was thin and stony, freckled with scrub grass and a handful of stunted cedars that grew bent and gnarled as though they had spent their whole lives losing an argument with the wind. There was no cabin, no fence worth the name, no sign that any of the dozen owners who had held this land since before the war had ever believed in it enough to drive a nail. The last man had looked at it and walked away without unpacking his wagon. I would learn his name later and understand his fear. I would never share it. And then I saw the spring. It came pushing out of a crack in the limestone at the foot of the bluff, with the patient, unhurried steadiness of something that had been doing exactly this for longer than there had been a county to name it. It pooled in a basin perhaps 10 feet across, and the water was blue. I want to be careful here, because the word does not carry the weight I need it to carry. It was not the blue of a clean sky resting on still water. It was blue the way a thing is blue when something has gone wrong with it, a deep and luminous color that leaned toward turquoise where the sun struck it and sank into a bruised indigo in the shadow of the rock. It looked like a warning from the old stories, the pool the witch tells the lost children never under any circumstances to touch. I approached it the way you approach anything that frightens and fascinates you, in the same breath, slowly, with my hands open and visible, as though the water might rear up if I moved too fast. It was beautiful. I will say that plainly because honesty has always served me better than drama. Whatever lived in that water, whatever the mountain had dissolved into it on its long passage through the dark, the result was the loveliest body of water I had ever knelt beside, clear straight down to the stones at the bottom 6 feet at the deepest, and the blue was not murk or cloud, but light itself caught and held the way a glass holds it. The small stones on the floor of the basin wore a pale frost of mineral that caught the sun and threw it back in tiny sparks. I knelt at the rim and cupped the water in my palms and lifted it to my face and breathed it in. There was no rotten egg stink of sulfur. There was no metal bite of copper at the back of my tongue. It smelled of stone, of clean, cold mineral rock, and beneath that something faintly sweet that I could not put a name to, a sweetness with no flower or fruit behind it. Mrs. Hooper, had she been standing there, would have knocked the water from my hands and lectured me until sundown. You do not drink what you cannot name. You do not drink water the color of poison. You do not drink from a basin that cattle refuse, with all 4 feet braced. But Mrs. Hooper was in the cold ground behind the home, and I was thirsty in a way that went deeper than my throat, and I had spent 7 years learning to trust the report of my own senses over the fear of people who had never bothered to look closely. I drank. It was the coldest water that has ever passed my lips, so cold it ached against my teeth and made my chest draw tight as a fist. And it was sweet, not the cloying sweetness of sugar, but the clean mineral sweetness that certain deep springs carry, the taste of limestone and time worked into water over a passage of years no human mind can hold. The blue had no flavor I could find. The water was simply water, cold and clean and finer than anything I had ever tasted, wearing a color it had picked up somewhere far below the roots of the mountain. That was the first great moment of my life, kneeling in the dirt with cold blue water running down my wrists, betting everything I had left on the evidence of my own tongue against the certainty of every soul in that valley. I did not die. I did not sicken. My belly did not cramp, and my head did not swim. I remained exactly who I had been the moment before I drank only considerably less thirsty and considerably more certain. I unrolled my tarp under the bent cedars, weighted its corners with rocks, and slept my first night on the cursed land, listening to the soft and ceaseless murmur of the spring, a sound I would come to love more than any hymn I ever heard sung indoors. For 2 weeks I lived under that canvas, while my hands tore and blistered, building a lean-to from cedar poles, and the rest of the tarp, a poor shelter that kept the rain off and little else. I dug a fire pit and learned which dead branches burned clean. I hauled water in a dented bucket Henshaw had let me take from a pile behind the office out of what I suspect was guilt, and all the while the spring went on, giving up its blue water at the foot of the bluff, indifferent to me, indifferent to the century of fear that had kept the rest of the world at a careful distance from its edge. The first thing I put into the ground was a tomato, and it was not the practical choice. April was already turning toward May, too late to start a tender crop from such a fragile beginning. A wiser girl, with a full belly to protect, would have planted something hard and forgiving potatoes or turnips, but I had carried one thing out of the Cumberland home that the matron never knew about, and planting Mrs. Hooper's seeds anywhere but in my own ground would have felt like a betrayal of the only person who had ever believed I had a brain worth feeding. I set the seedling 15 feet from the rim of the pool in the damp strip where the overflow creek kept the thin soil from going to dust. I watered it from the spring, hauling the blue water bucket by bucket and pouring it slow around the roots the way Mrs. Hooper had taught me, never on the leaves, always at the base where the plant could drink. Before I pressed the seedling into the earth, I took the tin can it had traveled in and I scratched 2 letters into the metal with the point of my pocket knife, A and W, Agnes Wren, the woman who taught me what soil was and the woman who named me for a bird that sings louder than its size. I set the marked can into the ground beside the seedling like a marker at a grave, except this was the opposite of a grave. This was the first thing I had ever put into ground that belonged to me, and I wanted the earth to know whose hands had done it. I told myself I expected nothing. I told myself the soil was too poor and the season too far gone. But some stubborn corner of me, the same corner that had laid $1 on Henshaw's counter, was watching that little plant the way a mother watches a feverish child, waiting to see which way it would turn. Within 7 days, something had gone wrong, or rather, something had gone so impossibly right that my mind kept reaching for the word wrong because it had no shelf to put the truth on. The seedling was not merely growing, it was reaching upward with a violence I had never witnessed in any garden under any sky. In 7 days, it had nearly doubled its height. The stem thickened where I could watch it thicken. The leaves broadened and went dark. Through the wall of the tin can, I could see the roots driving outward with an appetite that bordered on greed, as though the plant had been starved its whole short existence and had finally been led to a feast it intended to consume entirely. I stood over that tomato in the gray light before dawn, my breath fogging in the cold. The spring threw off, and a single thought rose up clear through everything Mrs. Hooper had ever taught me. It was the water. It had to be the water. There was no other variable, no richness in this stony ground, no special grace in this late and reluctant spring. The only thing I had given that plant that the rest of the lot had not received was the blue water carried up from the dark. I am not a woman who trusts a single witness, not even one as loud as that tomato, so I tested the thing the only way a poor girl with no laboratory can test anything, by planting more and watching close. I put in beans and squash and peppers, hills of corn and rows of lettuce, and I split each planting clean down the middle. One half I gave the blue spring water hauled by the bucket. The other half I watered with rain I caught in a barrel. Same seed, same soil, same sun, moving the same arc overhead. The only difference was the color of what I poured at their roots. The difference the plants gave back was almost more than I could hold in my mind. The spring-watered rows came up faster, stood taller, leaf darker. When the fruit and pods finally came, they were nearly twice the size and carried a flavor the rain-watered controls could not approach. I walked those divided rows every morning, and the gap between the two halves widened by the day, a living record of what the mountain had been offering freely to anyone brave enough or hungry enough to accept it. When the first great tomato finally ripened in the last days of June, it had swollen to the size of a man's fist, deep red, gone purple at the shoulders, heavy in my two hands as a river stone. I sat on the rough step of my lean-to and bit into it with the juice running warm down my chin and my wrist, and the flavor that filled my mouth was so far beyond anything I had believed a tomato could hold that I laughed out loud alone on my cursed land. Not a laugh of simple joy, though joy was tangled up in it. It was the helpless laugh of a person whose understanding of the possible has just been knocked flat, the sound a body makes when the world turns out to be larger and stranger and more generous than every authority ever swore it was. Word travels in a small valley, the way fire travels through dry grass. A boy named Clyde Marsh, 14 years old and hunting squirrels along the bluff, came around the base of the rock one afternoon and stopped dead at the edge of my 2 acres. He stood with his rifle forgotten in his hand and his mouth working before any sound came out, because there before him was a thing no living person in Grassy Cove had ever seen on that piece of ground. Green, not the gray-green of scrub clinging to life, but the deep, fat, riotous green of a garden in full abundance. Tomato vines already past my shoulder, corn throwing up its tassels weeks ahead of any field in the valley, beans climbing their poles as though they meant to lay siege to heaven. "What did you do to the dirt?" he finally said. It came out like an accusation, as though I had broken a law of nature he had been raised to believe was unbreakable. I told him the truth. I had done nothing to the dirt at all. I had only given it water. He asked if I meant the blue water, and there was real fear in the question, the inherited fear of a boy who had been warned off that spring since before he could walk. I told him yes, the blue water, and watched him take one step back, as though the green itself might be catching. He came back the next morning on his own without the excuse of squirrel hunting, and stood at the edge of the lot and looked in for a long time. I called him over and handed him a tomato. He held it and did not eat it for a while, turning it in his hands and looking at it the way you look at something that might change into something dangerous if you stop watching it. Then he ate it, and then he looked at me with an expression I had not expected from a 14-year-old boy. Not wonder exactly, something more like the feeling of having a long-held certainty crack open. "I won't tell anyone. This tastes like that," he said. "They won't believe it." "They'll believe it," I told him, "when they taste it themselves." He nodded, as though I had given him a task, and he left, and before the week was out, 3 families had made the walk to the back of the cove to see what the orphan girl and the cursed spring had done to the dirt. They came to look, not to buy. They stood at the edge of my lot and shook their heads at a thing their fathers and their fathers' fathers had sworn could not exist. Among them was Nathan Ledger, an old man whose family had worked the cove since before Tennessee was a state. He stood turning one of my tomatoes over in his cracked hands the way a jeweler turns a stone he suspects is false. His father had warned him off that water, he told me. His father's father had warned his father. Every soul in the cove had always known the spring was bad. I looked him in the eye and told him that every soul in the cove had always been wrong. He did not like that. I could see it, but he was a fair enough man to put the question to a test. He raised that tomato to his mouth and bit. I have learned to read a face in the moment. Certainty gives way to something it was not prepared for, and I watched it happen to Nathan Ledger, right there in the June light. He chewed slowly, then slower, then stopped chewing altogether, and simply held the fruit away from his face and stared at it as though it had just spoken to him in a voice he recognized from somewhere he could not name. "Lord have mercy," he said at last, his voice gone soft and strange. "That is the finest tomato I have ever put in my mouth." It was the first time a grown man of that cove had ever told me I was right about anything, and he did it with red juice on his chin and 100 years of his family's certainty cracking quietly behind his eyes. What I did not know, standing in my green rose, with that old man's praise still warm in the air, was that another man had been present at the edge of my lot for the last half hour. He stood apart from the group of families who had come to gawk, and his eyes were not on the tomato in Nathan Ledger's hand. They were on the blue water at the foot of the bluff. He was broad and well-fed, in a way no farmer in the cove was well-fed, his coat too fine for the dust of the back road, his boots untouched by any honest field. He did not come forward to taste the fruit or shake his head with the rest. He stood apart and he watched, and he counted something behind those flat, pale eyes. When he turned and walked back toward the road, he did not look at me at all. He measured his steps on the way out, the slow, deliberate pacing of a man estimating a distance, and then he was gone around the bend. I would learn his name was Silas Greer, and that he owned more of Grassy Cove than any other man alive, and that he was a person who had never in his life seen anything of value belonging to someone weaker, without beginning to calculate how it might be moved into his own hands. That evening, as the families drifted back down the cow path toward the road, I sat alone on the lean-to step with the cooling night coming down off the ridges and the spring whispering its endless conversation behind me. And as the last light went out of the sky, I noticed one more person at the far edge of the lane, standing where the path met the open field, not leaving with the others. A man about my age or a little older, with the build of someone who worked with his hands, and the stillness of someone who was comfortable being quiet. There was a trace of sawdust on the cuff of his sleeve, even in the fading light. When I looked at him, He did not look away. He only nodded once, the small, precise nod of a man acknowledging something he has made up his mind about, and then he turned and walked down the path in the direction of the road. I did not know his name. I would know it within the year, but I remembered the nod, small and sure as a nail-driven flush. It stayed in my mind longer than almost anything else from that day, which was already a day I would not forget. I lay down under my canvas that night and could not sleep for the turning of my own mind. I had $1's worth of cursed ground, a garden that defied every law this valley believed in, and the dawning understanding that the thing the whole world had warned me away from was the very thing that was going to feed me. Somewhere out in the dark, a man with fine, clean boots was lying awake too. I am certain of it, turning over the same green abundance I was turning over, though we wanted opposite things from it. I wanted to grow. He wanted to own. And between those two desires across the years that were coming, a whole war would be fought over a basin of blue water I had bought for $1 soft from a tired man who told me I did not want it. He had been wrong about that, the way fear is always wrong when it dresses itself up as good sense and tries to talk you out of the only thing worth having. By the second Saturday of August, Harold Pruitt's porch was empty by noon. That fact mattered more than it sounds. Pruitt ran the Crossroads store at the center of Grassy Cove with the careful suspicion of a man who had watched too many ventures fail and too many promises dissolve in the Tennessee heat. And when Clara had first approached him in the autumn of her first year, arms loaded with more squash and peppers and tomatoes than one girl could eat in 3 winters, he had agreed to let her set produce on his porch on consignment, with the private certainty of a man doing a charity. He does not expect to cost him anything. He took 30% of whatever sold. He was confident the arrangement would be brief and unprofitable and would give him something to shake his head about later. Instead, families who had walked out to the back of the cove to gawk at her impossible garden were now walking to the crossroads to ask when the next delivery was coming. By the end of the first season, Clara understood that what the cove was tasting, even when it could not name what its tongue was telling, it was concentration. Her fruit did not merely taste like more. It tasted like what the thing was supposed to be before generations of ordinary growing had thinned it into a suggestion of itself. Nathan Ledger's wife put up a batch of Clara's tomatoes into sauce and told anyone who would listen that her husband had wept at the supper table over a bowl of it. Clara could not vouch for the tears. She could vouch for the story spreading, because a community cannot keep that kind of tale to itself. Pruitt's certainty curdled into appetite right around the time he realized he had been taking 30% of something that could make him considerably richer. He proposed a new arrangement in the spring of Clara's second year, pulling her aside between customers on a busy Saturday morning with the tone of a man offering a favor. He wanted exclusive rights to sell everything she grew, 40% of all revenue. He would handle the customers, she would handle the growing, and wasn't that a fair division of labor for a girl who had no other market to go to? Clara set down the crate she was carrying and looked at him for a moment. She told him she had begun filling clean jugs from the pool and selling them as garden water at 5 cents each from the same porch, and that the water did not pass through his store and was not subject to any arrangement they had or might have. She told him she intended to keep selling it that way, and she told him that if he found the current terms unsatisfactory, she was prepared to set up her produce on the public verge of the road, which was not his property and did not require his consent. Pruitt's face moved through several expressions before settling on the one that meant he was recalculating. He did not accept her terms with any warmth, but he did not change them either, and that was enough. What he did instead was something she would not discover for another 2 months. Old Walt Finney came to her that same autumn, a lean man in his 70s who kept beehives on the mountain above the cove and who moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent decades working around creatures that punished impatience. He told her his bees had found her garden from more than a mile distant and had been working her late blossoms with a frenzy he had never seen in 50 years of keeping hives. He asked her leave to bring several hives down to the edge of her lot where the flowers ran richest. Clara said yes without hesitation, because Mrs. Hooper had told her once that a garden without bees was a church without a congregation, and she had understood that to mean both things were missing the essential point of their own existence. The honey Walt's bees produced from her garden was unlike any honey the cove had ever put in a jar, amber running toward gold, thick enough to hold the shape of a spoon, pulled through it carrying a complexity of flavor that seemed to contain every flower in her garden at once, with something underneath that no one could describe precisely, but no one could stop eating. Walt called it blue honey as a joke the first time because of where the bees were foraging, and the name stuck the way true names do. It began outselling every other comb at the crossroads within a month. 3 streams of trade now ran out of 2 acres of stony ground, and Clara was still sleeping in the cabin Ezra had not yet built under a canvas roof that collected frost on cold mornings. A girl getting rich in everything but money, which has its own way of drawing the kind of attention that arrives wearing good boots and a smile that does not reach its eyes. Silas Greer came up the cow path on a bright, cold morning in the second spring, and this time he did not stand at the edge of the lot watching from a distance. He came directly to her door, and he was not alone. Deputy Frank Colton walked 2 paces behind him, not close enough to be called an escort, but close enough to be called a presence. Colton's badge caught the morning light. He said nothing. He did not need to. Greer admired the garden in the flat, empty voice of a man who is pricing something rather than praising it. He asked as though it were the most natural courtesy in the world whether Clara had ever given thought to selling. He said it with the warmth of a neighbor stopping by for conversation, and she recognized immediately that the warmth was the most dangerous part of what he was doing. She told him she had bought the lot for $1 and intended to be buried in it. He laughed as though she had said something charming, and then he named a figure. She felt the number physically, a cold drop through the center of her chest, because it was more money than she had ever heard spoken in a single sentence, enough to buy good bottomland anywhere in 3 counties, enough to never haul water in a dented bucket again, or sleep under canvas, or worry about whether a bad season would end her. It was a figure designed to make a girl with nothing feel that she was being offered everything. Clara understood the mechanism of it. A man like Greer does not offer a fortune for 2 acres of thin, stony ground unless he has already calculated that those 2 acres will return him 10 fortunes once the girl who does not understand what she is sitting on has been moved gently aside. The offer was not generosity. It was the opening move of a longer game, and it assumed she did not know the rules. She knew the rules. "This water is the most valuable thing in this cove," Greer said, and his eyes finally met hers, directly dropping the courtesy for a moment to show her the calculation underneath it. "And you cannot hold it. A girl alone, no deed older than a season, no family to back your claim." She told him the deed in her hand was as good as any deed in his, that $1 paid clean was as legal as 1,000, and that the land was not for sale at any figure he could name. He tipped his hat to her with a courtesy more frightening than any threat she had ever received, and he left. Colton followed without a word. He paused once at the edge of the lot and looked toward the spring, then looked back at Clara with an expression she could not read, and then he walked away down the path. She stood in the garden after they left and listened to the spring and felt the cold certainty settle into her that she had not seen the last of Silas Greer. She had only seen the most pleasant version of him she would ever see. The second version arrived through rumor, which is a weapon that leaves no fingerprints. Within 2 weeks of Greer's visit, a story began moving through the cove. The blue water, the whisper went, had begun to sicken people. A child on a farm at the far end of the valley had spent a night vomiting after eating from a spring-watered garden. A man's hogs had died. The water that grew the great tomatoes was slow poison after all, and the orphan girl either did not understand what she was selling or did not care. Wise families would do well to pour out their jugs and keep their distance from the back of the cove before the curse found its way to their supper tables. There was no sick child. There was no dead hog. Clara knew this with a certainty that had no evidence behind it yet, only the knowledge of how Silas Greer operated and the simple observation that a story this specific, with this much momentum, does not arise on its own from nothing. A rumor needs a source. This one had a man with fine boots who had just been told no and was accustomed to getting yes. The damage was real, regardless of the source. Her sales at Pruitt's porch thinned within a single Saturday. Families who had walked miles for her fruit now walked past it with their eyes turned carefully away. Jugs of spring water sat unsold in the afternoon heat. Pruitt himself, who had pocketed a healthy portion of her revenue for 2 seasons, began suggesting that perhaps the porch arrangement was becoming inconvenient, that the talk was not good for his business, that perhaps she ought to find another arrangement. And then Deputy Frank Colton appeared at her lot on a Wednesday morning with a look on his face that she recognized as the expression of a man executing an order he finds distasteful but has not yet found a reason to refuse. There had been complaints, he told her, unofficial ones, but complaints. He had an obligation to investigate the water source. He needed to take a sample. She watched him kneel at the rim of the pool with a glass jar and fill it with the blue water and seal it. He looked at the color through the glass for a moment without speaking. "That color is not normal," he said. Color is not the same as danger, Clara said. Have you ever asked why it's that color? He stood up and looked at her, and she could see him thinking about that, actually thinking about it, rather than dismissing it, which surprised her. He did not answer. He took the jar and left. She did not know where he would take it. She did not know if the result would be used honestly or handed to Greer before anyone else saw it. She did not know if the law of Grassy Cove was a thing she could trust or a thing that would be used against her. She had never had sufficient experience with laws working in her favor to feel confident about them now. What she knew was that she could not wait for an institution to defend her. She had learned at 9 years old that institutions were not designed with her in mind. She loaded her cart on the following Saturday with the finest fruit her garden had ever produced, the great purple-shouldered tomatoes, at the peak of their ripeness, peppers, like red lanterns, squash so heavy a child could not lift them, and she pushed the cart the long miles to the crossroads, and she gave it all away. Not sold, given freely, pressed into the hands of every family that passed. But before any of them ate, she ate. She picked up a tomato and bit into it in front of the gathered porch, standing in the full heat of the Saturday morning, with the juice running down her hand, and she swallowed, and she stood there and let them watch her continue to exist. If this water is death, she said, her voice steadier than her heart, then I have been dying for 2 years, and I have never felt more alive. Clyde Marsh appeared beside her without being asked. He was 15 now, taller than she remembered, and he picked up a tomato from the cart and ate it standing next to her without ceremony or announcement. The son of a man the whole valley knew, eating the poison fruit in front of everyone, with no one having put him up to it. That was worth more than any argument she could have made, because adults believe the unscripted actions of children in ways they do not believe the scripted words of anyone over 20. It did not win everyone back in a single morning. A rumor with money behind it does not die in one Saturday, but it created a fissure in the certainty of the story, and a fissure is enough to begin with. The Cove started whispering a different question quietly and among themselves. If the water was poison, why was the girl eating what she grew with no sign of harm? Why was she giving away what a poisoner would hoard? Why did the dead hog and the sick child have no farm and no name that anyone asking could locate? Greer had taught her something with his rumor that he had not meant to teach. Fear travels on stories. A poison can be made entirely of words, and the only cure for a story poison is to stand in the open and let the watching world see that you are still alive. But she knew, standing in the crossroads heat with the empty cart beside her, that surviving a story was not the same as winning the argument. She needed something heavier than her own continued existence. She needed a truth with the weight of an institution behind it, which was an irony she did not miss, given that the only institutions she had ever encountered had been designed to manage her rather than defend her. That truth arrived the following summer in the form of a man on a hired horse with a leather case strapped behind the saddle. Dr. Edmund Crane taught natural philosophy and the chemistry of rocks at the State University in Knoxville. He had the careful gray clothing of a man who spent his days indoors with instruments and books, and his eyes moved over Clara's garden with a quality of attention she had not seen before in any visitor, not the wonder of the Cove families, not the calculating assessment of Greer, but the bright, restless hunger of someone who had spent a lifetime asking the question, why, and had not yet grown tired of the answers it produced. She met him with wariness. She did not try to hide, because he had not arrived, simply out of curiosity. He told her plainly that he carried a letter from the State Agricultural Society. There had been a formal complaint filed regarding potentially hazardous conditions at the Blue Spring lot. One of the signatories of that complaint, he said with careful neutrality, was a Mr. Silas Greer, described in the filing as a concerned neighbor and landowner. Crane had been sent to investigate the complaint. That was the correct word. Not to validate her work, not to praise the garden that had been making its way into the Agricultural Society's conversations secondhand through Nathan Ledger's inability to stop talking about a tomato that had remade his certainty. He was here to determine whether there was cause for the concerns that had been officially raised. She stood in the garden and looked at this man who had been sent by the same system Greer had filed his complaint with, and she understood that she was looking at either her best ally or the mechanism of her final defeat. He asked if he might stay several days to examine the water, the soil, and the fruit. He asked it as a question requiring her permission. After 2 years of being told by various men in various ways that she could not hold what she had, the act of being asked was so unexpected that it took her a moment to find the word yes. He worked for 3 days with instruments she had never imagined, glass tubes and papers that changed color, and a small brass balance that could measure things finer than her eye could detect. He drew water from the pool at different hours. He dug soil from the spring-fed beds and from the untouched scrub at the far edge of the lot, and laid them side by side in labeled papers. He cut into her tomatoes and weighed the flesh and the seed with the same quiet precision he applied to everything. He spoke as he worked more to himself than to her, and she followed every word the way she had once followed Mrs. Hooper down a bean row, collecting an education no institution had ever thought to offer a girl who had grown up poor. Then he packed his case, promised to send word when his analysis was complete, and rode back down the cow path toward Pikeville. The waiting stretched through the back half of that summer and into the autumn, and into that waiting Greer poured fresh poison. The rumor reached a new form. The professor had come to confirm what the Cove already suspected. The university would soon declare the spring a chemical hazard. Any family still buying from the orphan girl was buying trouble they would not be able to afford. Greer had learned to dress his lies in the borrowed authority of the very science that was moving toward exposing him, which is the oldest trick of a man who sees the verdict coming and tries to claim it before it arrives. The letter came in early October, and Crane himself came with it, riding back up the path in the cool morning, with his face carrying the specific expression of a scientist who has found something genuinely new and cannot contain the pleasure of sharing it. He sat on the rough step of Clara's lean-to and spread his notes across his knees. He told her what the mountain had been doing in the dark for longer than there had been a county to name it. The blue, he said, came from a mineral called vivianite, an iron phosphate that forms deep in limestone, where no air can reach, which dissolves into the water as it passes through. At the concentrations present in her spring, it was wholly harmless to any living creature. It was responsible for the color and for nothing else. But the color was only the smallest part of what the water carried, as it had traveled through miles of the richest limestone bedrock in the entire region. It had dissolved calcium and potassium and phosphorus and iron and a range of trace elements, besides all of them arriving at the foot of her bluff in a balance so near to perfect for feeding cultivated plant life that he had never seen its match in any natural source he had tested. The water was not a curiosity. It was the most fertile natural water he had set his instruments against in a professional lifetime of measurement, and every soul in the valley had been fleeing from it for 100 years because of its color alone. The reason nothing had grown near the spring, he explained, was devastatingly simple. Nothing cultivated had ever been planted there. Wild grasses and stunted cedars, bred for poor, thin ground, had no use for what the water offered and ignored it. But a tomato, a bean, an ear of corn, shaped by generations of human cultivation to respond to rich feeding with rich growth, encountered that water and responded with everything it had. The spring had not been killing the land. It had been waiting with the patience of stone for someone to plant the right kind of seed. And the cattle that had refused to drink, the bawling herds whose fearful behavior had become the founding legend of the cursed spring, had not been poisoned or even sensing danger. They had refused the water because the heavy mineral load made it taste foreign, nothing more. A cow turns away from strange before it turns away from harmful, and it cannot tell the difference because to a cow the concepts are identical. 100 years of inherited dread, built on the conservative instincts of animals who mistook unfamiliar for dangerous, and on men who never thought to question whether the animals were right. Crane told her he intended to set this before the learned men of the state in a formal written account, and he asked whether she had any objection to her name appearing in it. She told him she minded nothing that put the truth between a liar and his lies. What she did not yet know, sitting on that step in the October chill, was that Colton had come to see her 2 days before Crane's return. He had appeared at the lot in the late afternoon out of uniform, which she noticed. He set a folded paper on her porch rail without handing it to her directly. He told her that the water sample he had taken from her pool had been sent to the county office for analysis. He told her that the result had been redirected, that it had not gone to the Agricultural Society or to any neutral party, but had been received first by Silas Greer's attorney, who had then decided how it would be used. Colton had kept a copy for himself because something about the chain of handling had not sat right with him, which was a plain admission that Greer had reached into the process and bent it. "I didn't know whose side was right when I came here the first time," Colton said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the spring. "Now I know." He left before she could respond. She unfolded the paper after he was gone. It was a copy of the preliminary analysis in handwriting she did not recognize, and it said nothing about danger. It said the water contained elevated mineral concentrations inconsistent with standard sources and warranted further study. That was all. There was no finding of harm. There was no recommendation against use. There was only the elevated mineral reading, which Greer had been prepared to weaponize if Crane's full analysis had not arrived to make the partial result irrelevant. Greer had understood before any official body did that the science was going to go against him, so he had tried to intercept the science. He had reached into the mechanism of the investigation and redirected its findings to his own attorney, planning to use a partial result, stripped of context, to extend the rumor he had already built. A man who could not buy the spring had decided instead to poison the truth about it, the way he had already poisoned the story about it, from the same motive and with the same essential method. He had failed at both, but Clara knew the failure would sharpen him rather than stop him. A man who fights with rumors and lawyers does not stop when the first two weapons fail. He looks for a third. That winter he found one. The papers arrived by the hand of a constable who had the look of a man doing a duty he found personally disagreeable. Clara read them in the lean-to that had begun over 2 years of occupancy to feel less like a shelter and more like a cell. The legal language was dense and partially beyond her, but the essential claim was clear enough. Greer held the deeds to the land above and behind her lot, where the underground passages that fed her pool ran somewhere through his stone before they surfaced at her crack in the rock. He was filing a claim that the spring was rightfully his, that it merely surfaced on her land by geological accident, that the water itself originated on his property and belonged to him under every applicable principle of mountain water law. If he won, the spring was his. He could fence it, pipe it away, or simply close it off out of spite. 2 years of honest labor, a garden that had fed a community and changed what the cove understood was possible. The water she had built every part of her life on could be taken from her by the argument that she had bought the ground, but not the river running beneath it. The cold that settled into her that night was deeper than the cold the spring threw off into the night air. It was the cold of understanding that $1 and 2 years of work might count for nothing against a deed-rich man and a legal question that had never been decided in favor of someone who started with nothing. The matter went before a county judge in Pikeville on a gray morning in January. The courtroom smelled of wood smoke and wet wool and was packed wall to wall with people from the cove who had come to see whether the orphan girl or the land baron would walk out still holding the blue water. Greer arrived with a hired lawyer in a black coat and a stack of deeds going back 40 years, and he sat at his table with the serene posture of a man who has purchased every verdict he has ever needed and fully expects to purchase this one. At the back of the room, not seated with any faction, Clara noticed a woman she had not expected. Mabel Greer sat alone in the last row with her hands folded in her lap and her face carrying an expression that was not support for her husband and not contempt for Clara, but something more complicated than either, the expression of a woman who had once had nothing herself before she became the wife of the man she had married and who recognized in Clara's posture something she had not seen in a very long time. Clara arrived with no lawyer. She had no money for one. She had her dollar deed and one other thing, a letter from Dr. Edmund Crane of the State University addressed to the court, which Greer's lawyer had not known to fear until he saw her take it out. The lawyer for Greer spoke first, and spoke at length, building his argument stone by stone from mountain precedent and legal principle. The source of a water determined its ownership. The spring was the visible terminus of a passage that originated in his client's land. The girl had purchased the surface, but not what flowed beneath it. It was a sound argument. Clara did not pretend it was not. When her turn came, she did not argue law. She rose and asked the court's permission to read aloud a letter from a professor of natural philosophy at the State University, and she watched Silas Greer go very still at his table as she said it, because he understood in that moment what she was holding. Rumor was his weapon. It could be denied, redirected, reshaped. But a letter with a university seal and a scholar's signature beneath a factual determination was a different kind of thing entirely. She read Crane's account into the silence of that packed room, the Vivianite, the dissolved minerals, the decades of passage through limestone bedrock. The conclusion stated in the careful and unambiguous language of science that the underground passages of karst country cannot be owned as a man owns a field that water surfaces where the stone permits, and no surveyor can trace it to one man's deed, that the spring belonged in every meaningful sense to the ground it rose on, which was hers. The mountain does not read deeds, she told the court when she finished. Her voice came from somewhere below fear. It pours its gift where it chooses, and it has chosen 2 acres I bought honestly and hold honestly. No man can own what the whole earth made across 1,000 years and gave away for free. The judge took the letter in his own hands and read it again to himself. Greer's lawyer rose to object and found for perhaps the first time in his professional life that he had run out of material. The judge ruled that afternoon in the plain, unhurried way of a man who has weighed 2 arguments and found one heavier, that a spring rising on a lawfully held lot belonged to the holder of that lot, that no claim of unseen source could overturn the plain fact of where the water reached the light. The blue spring and its water were the lawful property of Clara Wren. She heard her own name spoken as the owner of the thing she loved most in the world in a court of law before the whole cove against the richest man in 3 counties, and something that had been clenched inside her since the day they put her belongings in a flour sack and told her to be grateful, slowly and completely let go. Greer left without looking at her. His serene posture had cracked into something rigid and white, the fury of a man who has never lost before and does not know yet what to do with the experience. She knew his fury was not finished. A defeat does not stop a man like that. It focuses him. At the back of the room, Mabel Greer rose from her seat. She did not approach Clara. She moved toward the door with the careful quiet of someone leaving before the crowd, and as she passed through the doorway, she turned her head and looked back once, not at her husband, at Clara, and then she was gone. When the crowd began to thin, Clara looked toward the back of the room and found the man she had not expected to see there, the man with sawdust in the seams of his coat, the one who had stood at the edge of her lot on that June evening and nodded once before walking away. He was here. He had been here the whole time in the last row near the door, watching her read her letter and win her water. And when she found his eye across the thinning room, he did not look away. He looked at her the way a man looks when he has arrived somewhere he intended to be, and then the departing crowd closed between them and he was gone. She did not know his name yet. She would know it within the week. And she did not know, walking out of that courtroom into the cold January air, with the deed still in her hand and the courts ruling behind her, that the steadiest love of her life had just watched her become a woman the world could no longer take from. Ezra Tarpley came back to the lot 6 days after the court ruling, in the early morning before the frost had lifted off the field grass, with a wagon loaded with cut cedar and the straightforward announcement that a woman who had just been declared the lawful owner of the most valuable water in 3 counties ought not to spend another winter under a canvas roof. Clara told him she had no money to pay a carpenter. He told her he had not asked for any. He said it without sentiment, the way he said most things, as though the words had been examined and found sound before he allowed them out. He told her that a man who built things for other people his entire working life eventually wanted to build one thing simply because the building of it was worth doing and that he had found his thing. She looked at him for a moment in the cold morning light. She asked him why he had followed her to the courthouse. He told her he had eaten one of her tomatoes from Pruitt's porch the summer before and had walked the 4 miles out to the back of the cove to see what kind of ground grew a thing like that, and found her gone to Pikeville. So he had gone to Pikeville. He said this with the same tone a man uses to describe any reasonable sequence of cause and effect. You followed me to a lawsuit because of a tomato, she said. He picked up his hammer. I followed the person who grew it, he said, and drove the first nail and did not elaborate further. He worked the way she had seen very few people work, with a total absence of wasted motion. He measured twice before cutting, once, a habit she recognized from Mrs. Hooper's teaching about gardens, where the preparation was always longer than the action and the action was always cleaner for it. His joints fit so closely they needed no nail to hold, though he used nails anyway, because he built things to last beyond any reasonable prediction of their use. He spoke less than he measured, and when he did speak, the words came out with the same precision as his cuts selected and placed. She brought him water from the spring each midday, the blue water he had heard dark stories about since before he had known she existed. He drank it without ceremony. He said it was good water, cold and clean, and asked nothing more about it than that. On the day the roof went on, he set his hammer down and walked to the rim of the pool and knelt at the edge the same way she had knelt on her first afternoon on the lot. He cupped the water in both hands and held it for a long moment before he drank. It's beautiful, he said. The wonder in his voice was genuine, the kind that comes from seeing something directly rather than through the filter of what you have been told to expect. Why was the whole cove afraid of this? Because it was different, Clara said, and people would rather flee from what they don't understand than do the work of understanding it. He looked at her across the surface of the pool with the same expression she had seen at the back of the courtroom, the expression of a man who has arrived where he meant to be, and she felt the ground under her own certainty shift in a way that was not unpleasant. They were married in the early summer of 1886 at the crossroads, a ceremony small enough that the whole of it fit on Pruitt's porch with room left over. Nathan Ledger stood as witness. Old Walt Finney's bees worked the clover in the adjacent field, and provided a low, persistent music that cost nothing and suited the occasion better than anything hired would have. Clara became Clara Wren Tarpley, a name with a husband folded into it for the first time in her life, and she turned the new name over in her mind that evening, the way you turn a tool in your hand to find the proper grip. Ezra did not stop building when the cabin was finished. He quarried limestone from the bluff with a patience that matched the bluff's own, and laid up raised planting beds so the spring beds no longer drowned in the wet seasons. He cut a system of shallow channels from fitted stone that ran the blue water evenly to every row without anyone having to carry a bucket, the water finding its own way through the courses he had shaped for it with the same care he put into furniture joints. The garden that had been 2 acres of stubborn defiance became a thing of genuine order, and the soil responded to the order the way it had responded to the water deepening from rocky gray to rich dark brown as the minerals accumulated and the earthworms arrived and the whole invisible community of the ground took up residence and went to work. The greatest thing Ezra built was the spring house raised over the pool itself in the 3rd year of their marriage. He used thick stone walls to hold the cold and set glass panels into the roof so the blue light still rose upward on sunny days and lit the interior of the small building with a glow that had no equivalent in any other structure. In the cove, a deep shifting luminescence that moved across the stone walls the way light moves across the bottom of a clear lake. She asked him why he had gone to the trouble of glass when plain shingle would have kept the rain off just as well. He set the last pane into its mortar and stood back to watch the light come through. Some things are too fine to keep in darkness, he said. This valley kept it in darkness for 100 years. I won't do that for one more day. The spring house became the thing visitors remembered most about the Tarpley lot. People came from across the cove to stand inside it and watch the mountain's gift glow through the glass beneath their feet, and nearly all of them came out quieter than they went, in the way people come out of places that remind them the world is larger than their daily concerns. They had 4 children in the years that followed. All 4 of them grew up with a faint blue tint to their fingernails from playing in the spring shallows, which was the closest thing to a birthmark the water could confer, and which marked them to anyone who knew what it meant as children of that particular piece of ground. They grew up with the finest food in Tennessee as their ordinary standard for what a meal was supposed to be, which ruined them for the ordinary world in ways they did not fully appreciate until they encountered it. Pearl, the oldest and sharpest-eyed, came home from a church supper in Pikeville one autumn afternoon with her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Their tomatoes, she told Clara, had no taste. They were just wet. Those are ordinary tomatoes, Clara told her. Ours are blue spring tomatoes. There is a difference you were lucky enough to be born already knowing. Pearl set her jaw in the precise way Clara had seen in her own mirror since she was 9 years old. Then I never want an ordinary tomato as long as I live. If you feel that strongly, you had better learn to tend the spring. She did. All 4 children did, with the seriousness of people who understood from early on that the thing their family was built on required active care rather than passive inheritance. Mabel Greer came to the lot one morning in the spring after the wedding alone and on foot, which Clara noted. She carried a small bunch of wild azalea cut from the ridge, and she set it on the porch step without being invited and without explaining herself. She did not ask to come inside. She stood in the yard and looked at the garden and at the spring house with its glass roof already catching the morning light, and her face held the expression Clara had seen at the back of the courtroom, the complicated recognition of a woman who had once lived close to nothing herself. Clara came out to meet her. They stood in the yard together for a moment without speaking. "He was wrong," Mabel said finally. "I knew it before the court did." She said it not as a confession and not as an apology, but as a plain statement of fact that had needed saying and had now been said. Then she looked at Clara directly, and there was something in the look that Clara recognized as the thing women offer each other when words have reached their limit. Clara nodded. That was sufficient for both of them. Mabel walked back down the cow path, and Clara watched her go and then went back to her garden. Silas Greer was not finished, though his methods changed as his power over the cove slowly shifted in the wrong direction from his perspective. The lawsuit had cost him something more durable than money. It had cost him the quiet assumption of his neighbors that he always won, which was the real currency his operation ran on, and that kind of currency does not replenish quickly once it has been spent visibly in public. He watched the orphan girl become the woman the valley turned toward, watched her Saturday teaching sessions fill with families who had once bought his version of every story, watched the blue honey sell faster than any other product at the crossroads, and the spring water go into gardens across the cove with results he could measure in the comparative lushness of any lot that used it. He could not abide the watching. Some men accept defeat as a cost of doing business. Greer was not built for that. His last move came without warning, the way the moves of a man without good options always come. One morning in her third spring of marriage, Clara walked to the spring house at dawn and found the channel Ezra had cut from the bluff, fouled with poured tar and broken stone. The fitted courses had been smashed in 3 places. A sack of something caustic had been emptied into the head of the pool where the water came up from the rock. The blue water had gone gray and clouded around the contamination, and for one long, terrible hour, standing in the cold morning, looking at the ruined channel, Clara believed Greer had finally found the means he had always been working toward. Not ownership, not legal maneuvering, simply destruction which requires no deed and leaves no argument to counter. Clyde Marsh was 22 years old now and working a farm adjacent to the bluff. He found the wagon tracks in the lane before noon and knew whose wheels had made them. He did not go to the sheriff's office, where the process would be slow and the outcome uncertain. He went to Nathan Ledger's house at midday and to Walt Finney's place an hour later, and by the following morning, 6 families had come to the lot and set up camp in the field around the spring house. They did not come armed. They came with bedrolls and cook fires and the firm intention to be present and visible, because a man who commits malice in darkness relies on darkness, and they were removing it. If Greer came back, he would do so in front of witnesses whose names he knew and who knew his. He did not come back. The spring itself completed what the families had begun. The steady pressure of water rising through the limestone drove the contamination outward, with a persistence that had nothing to do with human effort, the same indifferent force that had been pushing water up through that crack in the rock since before the county existed. Within 2 days the blue had returned, and it came back deeper and clearer than it had been before, the way a healthy thing reasserts itself once the interference has passed. Ezra rebuilt the channel stronger than the original setting, larger stones at the points that had been smashed and bedding them deeper so that removing them would require more work than any act of spite in the dark was worth. And the cove, which had seen the smashed stone and heard whose name the tracks in the lane belonged to, turned against Silas Greer in a way that no court ruling had turned it. A man who poisons a young mother's water source is a man whose word carries nothing afterward, whose rent comes in slow and grudging, whose neighbors greet him across a distance that gets no shorter with time. His holdings began to lose value, not because the land itself changed, but because the people working it had quietly stopped being afraid of him, and without their fear, his authority over them was revealed as the hollow thing it had always been. He had spent his power trying to break something the mountain refused to let stay broken, and the breaking had come back to him. He came to Clara's door one final time, years after the lawsuit. He was an older man by then, his broad frame diminished in ways that had less to do with age than with sustained defeat, his fine boots worn down to the leather without having been replaced. His land had gone piece by piece to creditors sold at the prices desperation accepts rather than the prices confidence commands. A smaller man in terms of pride would have survived it. Greer had not known how to be smaller. He did not come to threaten. He did not come to make an offer. He came because of his son. The young man stood behind him in the yard, quiet and composed, with none of his father's hunger in his face, and enough of his father's hard-won knowledge to understand that the Blue Spring was the most valuable agricultural resource in the county. He wanted to learn to use it. He wanted to learn to grow. Greer told her, with his voice stripped of every courtesy she had once found more frightening than a direct threat, that he had told his boy there was only one teacher worth seeking in Grassy Cove. He said it without looking away from her, which cost him something. She could see it cost him. Clara looked at this man who had offered her a fortune to leave, who had spread poison through her community's mouth, who had sued her in a court of law, who had sent men to smash her husband's stonework and foul her spring in the dark. She looked at him standing in the yard of the home he had tried to prevent her from building, asking her to teach his child the thing he had spent years trying to take. There is a kind of victory that arrives with noise and heat, and there is a kind that arrives in silence. What she felt standing in the yard looking at Silas Greer was entirely silent. "Send him Saturday," she said. "I don't hold a father's account against his son. The water never poisoned anyone, Silas. The teaching won't either." The son came every Saturday after that. He turned out to have a genuine aptitude, a quality of attention to detail that his father had possessed but applied toward acquisition rather than cultivation. Watching a Greer kneel in her rows and learn the terms of the bargain between plant and ground was the closest thing to forgiveness that either she or Greer was constituted to manage, and it was enough. The hardest years came not from any human adversary, but from the sky itself, when the rains failed across the plateau for 2 full summers, and the cove that had always lived on the narrow edge of sufficiency began to understand what genuine scarcity felt like. The thin, marginal soil of the high farms cracked and blew. Corn came up stunted and seeded early in the desperate mathematics of a plant that knows it is dying. The creek shrank to thread, and the wells dropped below the reach of buckets. Families who had managed in good years found their stores running out before winter had properly begun, and the old fear came back into the valley, not the fear of blue water, but the older and more fundamental fear of an empty season with children who needed feeding. Clara's spring did not fail. It poured its water up from the limestone with exactly the same constancy in the dry years as in the wet, drawing on reserves that no surface drought could touch, indifferent to the cloudless sky, in the same way it was indifferent to the fear of the cove. Clara stood in her still green garden in the second summer of the drought, with abundance surrounding her and the valley withering on every side, and she understood with a completeness that settled into her bones that she was holding the difference between a hard winter and a deadly one for every family in that bowl of ground. She could have done what Greer would have done. She understood the arithmetic of desperation pricing, and she knew what the numbers would produce. She did not do it. She filled jugs until her arms gave out and lined them at the crossroads for any family to take without a coin changing hands. She distributed seedlings already strong and deep-rooted before they ever touched another garden soil. She opened her Saturday sessions to anyone who would come, regardless of whether they had ever bought from her or believed in her or stood at the edge of her lot in the early days and shaken their heads at the impossible green. Clyde Marsh organized the younger men of the valley into a distribution system, loading wagons at dawn and running water to the farms most distant from the crossroads. The system he built in those 2 drought summers was the rough sketch of what his generation would later formalize into the cooperative, the pipes and channels that would eventually carry blue spring water to every farm in Grassy Cove. He had been 14 years old and frightened of a tomato when he first stood at the edge of her lot. He was a man of 30 now, directing wagons before sunrise, and the distance between those 2 versions of himself was the story of what one spring and one woman's decision to share rather than sell could do to a community over time. Ezra found her one evening filling the 30th jug of the day, her back bent and her hands cracked from the work, giving away what every sensible calculation said she should be selling at the highest price the season would bear. "You're giving away your advantage," he said, not as criticism, as the honest observation of a man trying to understand his wife. She straightened up and held the full jug and looked at him in the fading light. "Agnes Hooper gave me everything she knew and never asked a cent for it," she said. "She used to tell me that knowledge held back is knowledge that dies with the person holding it. I think water works the same way. Keep it and it goes stagnant. Give it and it keeps moving." He looked at her for the length of a long breath. Then he picked up an empty jug and knelt beside her at the channel and began to fill it. They worked side by side until the light was entirely gone, 2 people giving away an advantage that came back to them in a form no ledger could record. When the rains returned at the end of the 2nd summer, the cove had survived, not comfortably, not without difficulty, but without the losses that had seemed inevitable in July. The families who came through it knew who had carried them, and they did not forget. Henshaw, the old assessor with the permanently ink-stained fingers, had been buying Clara's tomatoes at the crossroads every Saturday for years by then. He was gray and slow now, the vigor of middle age long spent, and he stood at Pruitt's successor's counter on the same side of the ledger he had stood on his entire working life, except that now he was the customer rather than the gatekeeper. One morning he brought his granddaughter, a girl of 8 or 9, with 25 cents she had saved and the intention of spending it on something worth keeping. The child held out her coins and asked what she could buy. Henshaw looked at Clara across the produce table. Clara looked at Henshaw. Neither of them said anything about the soft, worn dollar bill from the spring of 1881, about the ledger with the Blue Spring lot listed at 75 cents, about the sigh of a tired man watching a 16-year-old refuse to be saved from herself. They did not need to say any of it. The silence between them held the whole of it perfectly well. Clara put a tomato in the child's hand and waved away the coins. The girl bit into it with the unceremonious appetite of someone who has not yet learned to distrust the things that are offered freely, and her face did what faces do when they encounter something genuinely beyond expectation. Henshaw nodded. That was all. The nod of a man who has watched the world prove larger than his own caution and has made his peace with having underestimated it. He bought his tomatoes and went home. Dr. Crane returned to the cove after the drought years with a younger colleague and a plan for a 5-year systematic study of the spring's effects across 12 varieties of crop and 3 soil types. He had gone gray himself in the time since he first rode up the cow path with his leather case. The restless brightness of his early curiosity settled now into the patient certainty of a man who has spent his life turning slow truths into permanent record. He worked Clara's land season after season, weighing and measuring with the same precision as before, but on a scale that required a second set of hands to manage. The results, when he set them before the state's learned men, were figures that Clara found difficult to credit, even having lived inside the evidence that produced them. Yields raised by nearly half on some crops, more than doubled on others. Nutritional density in the fruit a third higher than anything grown on common water sources in the region. The mountain had been offering this freely for as long as anyone could measure, and the cove had spent a century and more walking past it. But the line from Crane's account that she carried longest was not in the figures. It was in the acknowledgments, where a man of science set down for the permanent record of the state that he was indebted to Clara Wren Tarpley, who had the courage to plant where her entire valley was afraid to drink. He cited the first tomato, the single seedling in its punch tin can, as the earliest documented evidence of everything his 5 years of careful study had proven. A girl with $1 and a stolen seed had become a citation in the knowledge of the state. There was no fortune Silas Greer had ever dreamed of accumulating that she would have traded for that single line of ink. The state itself moved eventually, as states do slowly, and with the deliberateness of institutions that believe their own permanence. Word of the Blue Spring reached the capital through Crane's published accounts and through the Agricultural Society, reports that had been accumulating for years, and men who had never walked Clara's rows decided that a natural water source of such documented value ought to be entered in the permanent record and set under the protection of the law. The 2 acres purchased for $1 soft dollar were assessed and entered in the county books at a figure that would have dropped a younger Henshaw's pen. The cursed lot had become the most valuable small holding in the region, the worst piece of ground in the entire county, remade by patience and blue water and the willingness of one person to trust her own tongue over the inherited fear of everyone around her. Ezra died on a September afternoon in 1915 on the porch he had built to face the bluff so that the morning light would come in off the pale stone. A glass of blue spring water rested at his elbow, the same water he had knelt to drink on the day the roof went on and drunk every day of the 29 years of their marriage. The water that had given his teeth a faint mineral tint and turned his already careful woodwork into something the cove spoke of with a particular admiration. He died the way he had lived, without excess motion or unnecessary noise, with the murmur of the spring running beneath the porch and the ridges going gold in the late afternoon light, and nothing left unfinished that he had meant to finish. Clara had held his hand as the afternoon went long, and she felt the precise moment when the hand she was holding became simply a hand present, but no longer answering. She buried him near the foot of the bluff in the sound of the spring, because the spring had been the music underneath everything in their life together, and it was the right place. For the stone above him she had the mason carve the words Ezra himself had spoken years before, and traced first into the dirt with a stick for the mason to follow, exactly because they were his words and they deserved to remain his. This water was always good. We were only afraid of the color. Wren was not. He had called her Wren from the beginning, the name her mother had given her for the smallest bird that sings the loudest, and she had let him be the only person who used it because it was the name she had been before the world had required her to become something harder. Pearl stood beside the grave that evening after the others had gone and asked the question she had been holding since the funeral began. "Did you ever regret buying that land?" she asked. "Did you ever wish you had taken Greer's money and gone somewhere easier?" Clara looked at the spring house, catching the last of the day's light through its glass roof, at the garden laid out in the channels Ezra's hands had cut, at the 4 children and their families standing in the field beyond the fence. "I regret every day that no one found it sooner," she said. "Think of the seasons this valley lost, because they were afraid of a color in the water." Pearl was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at her mother with the sharp eyes she had been born with and the understanding she had spent a life adding to them. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they have received something they know they will carry. The years after Ezra moved at the pace of seasons rather than events. Clara's hands were in the soil every morning, before the coffee boiled, before the household stirred, before anything that required her attention had yet announced itself. The blue water ran through the stone channels Ezra had cut, so true they had not needed repair, finding its way to every row as it had found its way through the limestone by the patient logic of water seeking the path prepared for it. The children grew and married and stayed near the cove, which pleased her more than she told them, because she understood that staying near was a choice rather than a limitation, and that the cove was worth choosing. The grandchildren arrived with the same faint blue at their fingernails and the same complete indifference to ordinary food that Pearl had announced at 9 years old as a life position and apparently passed along as inheritance. In her last years, her sons engineered a system of clay pipe that carried the blue water from the pool out to farms across the valley, the mountain's gift traveling now through joined lengths of fired earth rather than through stone channels or hand-carried buckets. Water she had once hauled one bucket at a time now ran through miles of pipe to ground she would never walk. The thing she had bought for $1 and hauled by hand had become the shared resource of the entire valley, feeding the whole bowl of Grassy Cove in the way it had always had the capacity to feed it provided someone was willing to accept what it offered. Clyde Marsh, gray-haired now and deliberate in his movements, in the way of men who have done physical work their whole lives, ran the cooperative with the same organized competence he had shown organizing wagon routes during the drought. He had been 14 years old and afraid of a tomato. He had become the man who brought the mountain's gift to every farm in the cove. Clara watched him at the cooperative meetings and thought about what a single conversation and a freely offered piece of fruit could set in motion across a lifetime, and felt something that was not quite pride, but was in the neighborhood of it. The tomatoes were still grown from seed saved in an unbroken line every year since the punch tin can. They sold now at markets in Nashville and Knoxville at prices that would have been incomprehensible to the man who had once assessed their origin land at 75 cents. The spring still ran blue cold and sweet, still carrying its freight of dissolved mountain up through the crack in the limestone as it had carried it before. There was a county to name the cove, or a girl to kneel at its rim and drink. The spring of 1927 came early. The redbuds along the eastern ridge were already past their best color when Clara went to the garden on the morning Pearl would find her, and the first tomato bed was showing the deep green of plants in their full vigor, the color that had once seemed impossible on that piece of cursed ground and now seemed as natural as the stone it grew beside. She knelt in the row beside the bed she had planted in the first April. The soil was dark and giving under her hands everything Mrs. Hooper had promised it could become if given what it needed, and asked to do no more than it was built to do. 46 years of amendment had turned this ground from thin stony gray into something that felt genuinely alive under the pressure of her palms, which it was in the way Mrs. Hooper had first described to a 9-year-old girl who wanted to know why one row of beans grew taller than another. She put her hands into the earth. Perhaps she was planting something, as Pearl would say, afterwards setting one more seed into the ground with the same faith that had characterized every seed she had ever pressed into this soil, that the earth would accept what was offered and return it transformed. Perhaps she was listening, as her youngest would say, an ear turned toward the nation of small creatures laboring in the dark that Mrs. Hooper had first described to her, and that she had spent a lifetime honoring and tending and defending, and in the end belonging to. The spring ran on behind her the way it had run before she came, and would run after she was gone, blue and cold and clean, carrying what the mountain had prepared for anyone willing to receive it. The same water that had frightened a valley for 100 years and fed a family for 46. The same water she had knelt to drink when she had nothing else left to trust. It was still good water. It had always been good water. And the question it had asked her on her knees at the rim, with cold running down her wrists, and the whole cove telling her she was wrong, was the question she had spent every year since trying to pass along to anyone who would listen. What blue spring are you walking past? What gift has the world been holding out to you in a color you were taught was wrong, while the people who have never tasted it tell you the water is bad, the dollar land is out there, the spring is flowing? The fear that has been keeping you from the rim was never wisdom. It only wore wisdom's clothes. Stop listening to the ones who never wet their lips. Kneel down and drink.